As part of the final run-up to Monday's caucuses, great TV stations across Iowa, including KTIV, are talking to voters about the decision that they'll make on January 15th.
That's right. KTIV's Clayton Anderson traveled to Sioux County, and by voter registrations, it's one of the state's most Republican counties in Iowa. Well, tonight we learn what's on the minds of voters in that particular county.
In 2020, 83% of voters in Sioux County voted for Donald Trump over Joe Biden, making it one of the reddest counties in Iowa. In 2024, some Sioux County Republicans say they're looking for a GOP alternative to the former president.
I think that we do need a change, and I believe both DeSantis and Nikki Haley will provide us the same type of leadership in the policies that we support and not have as much challenge, questions that came along with the Trump era.
Another Sioux County voter, Ross Koopmans, agreed. He's supported President Trump in the past, but doesn't know if he's the best option this time around.
I have mixed feelings. I agree with a lot of his ideas. I just don't know if he's the best candidate because there's so many people who dislike him. I think there's other candidates like Ron DeSantis who has really good ideas, kind of comes from the same place, but I would think he'd get a lot more voters on his side. You know, some of the in-between voters, there's a lot of people who are very polarized with Trump.
Koopmans wants a candidate that can win the general election. He's impressed by DeSantis.
I've been really impressed how he's ran his state of Florida, and so I think that's something that, you know, the country could use.
Some Sioux County Republicans would prefer to keep their presidential preference to themselves. That said, they're still very much involved, like one poll worker we talked to.
We're sticking with just mum's the subject on some of the things. We participate, though.
Joan Koima says former President Trump has done good things, and she wants someone that can showcase qualities to run the country.
We want something that's going to be a good leader, and so we're hoping that the good leader comes out as a winner.
Democrats are in the minority in Sioux County. In 2016, just 399 Democrats caucused countywide, and the party had just one caucus site for Democrats. But this year will be different. The presidential preference process will be done by mail. Results will be announced on Super Tuesday, and the party will still meet to discuss party business and elect leadership positions on January 15th. Democrat Kim Van Ness says it's important she participates.
And we talk about platform resolutions, and I believe that those resolutions should be grassroots, should come from the people, and go on to the state party and eventually the national party. So developing the platform is important to me.
Two parties with one goal, electing a president, and Iowa takes the first step. In Sioux County, Clayton Anderson, KTIV News 4.
Democrats will still meet to discuss party business and elect leadership positions on January 15th.